Have you ever looked at a map of the world and just been floored by the sheer size of Canada? It's the second largest country on Earth, a colossal stretch of land. But here's the paradox, the real head-scratcher. Almost nobody lives there. Today, we're diving deep into this geographical mystery. We're going to explore the absolutely audacious, almost impossible story of how a nation was stitched together across a vast, frozen continent. But as we're about to find out, the grand ambition to build a country from sea to sea came with a hidden price tag, one that Canada and the world is still paying today.
Okay, let's just jump right into the heart of the paradox. If you pull up a population map of Canada, it's shocking. You see this thin, almost fragile little line of cities and towns huddled right up against the US border. And then, nothing. Just a vast, sprawling emptiness that stretches north all the way to the Arctic. 90% of the country is virtually uninhabited. So the central question becomes, how on earth do you forge a single unified nation out of that? How do you build a country when the overwhelming majority of its landmass is an immense, frozen, and profoundly challenging void?
You see, the founders of Canada, they weren't thinking small. They had this grand, incredibly poetic vision. Back in 1864, one of the fathers of Confederation, Sir Leonard Tilley, was inspired by a line from the Bible, Psalm 72 to be exact, and he proposed the title Dominion of Canada. And the motto that came with it, Amare usque ad mare, or from sea to sea, wasn't just some catchy slogan. No, it was a declaration. It was a statement of profound intent. It was this powerful, all-consuming dream of building a nation that would span an entire continent, rivaling the great powers of the world. But a dream, no matter how grand, is one thing. The brutal reality of Canadian geography, that was something else entirely.
Right. So to truly grasp the scale of the challenge these founders were facing, we have to start with the main antagonist of our story, the geography itself. We're talking about a landscape of unbelievable extremes that, from day one, dictated where people could live, where they could farm, and where they simply couldn't.
And this, right here, this is the fundamental conflict at the heart of the Canadian story. The vision was beautiful, right? A thriving, unified nation stretching proudly from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But the reality was a geographical nightmare, a vast, frozen, unforgiving landscape that seemed almost designed to resist human settlement. The Canadian Shield, a massive expanse of ancient rock, made farming impossible across huge swaths of the country. And then there was the cold, the sheer, bone-deep cold that locked up the north for most of the year. So the monumental challenge for Canada's builders was this. How do you possibly conquer this geography? How do you build a nation on ice?
Well, they came up with an answer. An incredible, audacious, some might say insane solution. They decided if they couldn't settle the land easily, they would tame it. They would physically stitch the country together with a great, unbending spine of iron.
You have to put yourself in the mindset of the 19th century. This quote from an early railway promoter, Asa Whitney, captures it perfectly. The idea that steam power could annihilate time and space was the equivalent of our internet revolution. For a young, fragile country like Canada, separated by thousands of kilometers of pure wilderness, this wasn't just about making travel faster. This was about survival. The railway was seen as the one technology, the one great hope that could conquer the tyranny of distance and hold this impossible country together.
And they didn't just build it, they built it with a frantic, almost desperate speed. Look at this timeline. It was a railway building frenzy. In just over 30 years, a whole series of massive transcontinental projects crisscrossed the northern part of the continent. But the big one, the critical artery for Canada, was the Canadian Pacific Railway, finished in 1885. This was a mind-boggling feat of engineering. It physically connected the brand new province of British Columbia, all the way on the Pacific coast, to the rest of Canada in the east. It wasn't just a railway, it was the fulfillment of a promise, the very glue holding the new confederation together.
And this is the part that's so crucial to understand. These railways were so much more than just a way to get from point A to point B. They were powerful instruments of national policy. The government and the railway companies were essentially partners in the grand project of nation building. The goal was threefold. 1, people the prairies. Get settlers out onto that vast empty land. 2, move resources. Get the wheat, lumber, and minerals from the interior out to the ports and onto the world market. And 3, maybe most importantly, build a nation. Solidify Canada's claim to the West and create a single integrated economy that could stand up to the ever-present threat of American expansionism.
So, we've seen how Canada forged this incredible iron spine across the continent. It was an amazing achievement. But conquering the land? That was only half the battle. There was another massive geographical obstacle to overcome: water. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how a country gets built, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button. That way, you won't miss what's coming next.
All right, so after conquering the land with thousands of kilometers of steel rail, Canada's nation builders turned their attention to the water. Their next great project was just as ambitious: to create an industrial superhighway that would connect the very heart of the continent to the Atlantic Ocean, and from there to the rest of the world.
And this was their answer: this St. Lawrence Seaway. Think of it as a giant staircase, or an elevator, for shits. It's this incredible system of locks, canals, and channels that allows massive ocean-going cargo vessels to sail right past the rapids of the St. Lawrence River and climb all the way into the Great Lakes. This was a total game changer. It literally transformed inland cities like Toronto, Cleveland, and Chicago into international seaports. It was a modern marvel that completely re-engineered the geography of North American trade.
Now, just like the railway, this wasn't some idea that popped up overnight. The dream of a deep waterway into the continent's heartland had been around since the 1890s. But it took more than half a century of fierce debate, complex negotiations, and sheer political willpower before Canada and the United States finally agreed to build it together. Construction started in 1954, and just 5 years later, in 1959, this colossal project was officially open for business.
And the price tag? For the time? It was astronomical. 470 million Canadian dollars in 1959. But here's the really telling part. Canada, the country with the much smaller economy at the time, paid the lion's share of that bill, over $336 million. Why? Because for Canada, this was never just an economic project. It was a massive statement of national sovereignty and pride, a strategic investment to ensure that its industrial heartland would have a direct, all-Canadian route to the sea.
So, there we have it. These two colossal, continent-spanning projects, the Transcontinental Railway and the St. Lawrence Seaway. Together, they physically built the Dominion of Canada. It's a triumphant story of engineering, vision, and sheer determination against impossible odds, right? Well, is that the whole story? Not even close. Because now we get to the twist.
This is the moment where our story takes a sharp turn. Because while these grand corridors of steel and water absolutely did build a country, they weren't built on just ambition and concrete. They came with immense hidden costs. Costs that weren't shared equally. Costs that were paid by specific communities and by the environment itself in ways that are still echoing today. Let's start with the railway. Its human cost was staggering. The most treacherous sections, blasting through the Rocky Mountains, were largely built by thousands of Chinese laborers. They were given the most dangerous jobs for far less pay than white workers, and hundreds died from accidents, landslides, and disease. At the same time, the Canadian government was actively working to discourage Black Americans from settling on the prairies, wanting to build a predominantly white West. And as the Dominion expanded, it simply took over vast territories from the Hudson's Bay Company without any consultation with the Métis people who already lived there, which directly led to armed resistance and uprisings led by their leader, Louis Riel.
And the discrimination against the Chinese community didn't stop when the last spike was driven into the railway. In fact, it got worse. In 1885, the very same year the railway was completed, the Canadian government imposed a $50 head tax on every single Chinese person entering the country. Look how that tax was systematically increased over the years, reaching an absolutely crippling $500 by 1903. This was a deliberately racist policy designed to restrict immigration from the very community that had just sacrificed so much to build the nation's iron spine.
The Seaway, for its part, came with its own devastating unintended consequences. But these ones were ecological. The intention, of course, was to create a highway for ships to boost global trade. The unintended reality, it also created a superhighway for invasive aquatic species. The most infamous of these is the zebra mussel. These tiny mollusks hitched a ride into the Great Lakes in the ballast water of ocean-going ships, and once they arrived, they spread like wildfire, causing catastrophic damage to local ecosystems, clogging intake pipes for power plants and water supplies, and costing billions of dollars. But maybe the greatest environmental cost of all is the one that we're only just beginning to truly understand. And it lies in the very foundation of Canada's north, something called permafrost.
Now, this isn't just regular frozen ground that thaws in the summer. This is ground that has remained frozen solid year-round for at least 2 consecutive years. In many places, it's been frozen for thousands of years. It's the bedrock upon which Arctic life and all northern infrastructure is built. For generations, this permafrost was seen as permanent, stable, reliable. You could build houses on it, roads, pipelines, entire towns. It was just the way the North was. But now we understand that this foundation isn't permanent at all. As our climate warms at an accelerating rate, the permafrost is beginning to thaw, and locked within that thawing ground is a ticking clock with truly global consequences.
So what exactly is locked inside that frozen ground? Carbon, a truly mind-boggling amount of it, from millennia of plants and animals that died and were flash frozen before they could decompose. The latest estimates suggest that the world's permafrost holds around 1,400 gigatons of carbon. Let me try to put that number into perspective for you. That is roughly 2.5 times more carbon than is currently floating around in the entire Earth's atmosphere. All of it, locked away in a deep freeze. For now.
And this, right here, is the terrifying conclusion. As the permafrost thaws, microbes wake up and begin to break down all of that ancient organic matter. And as they do, they release huge amounts of carbon dioxide and methane, powerful greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere. This creates one of the most dangerous feedback loops on the planet. The warming thaws the permafrost, the thawing releases carbon, the carbon causes more warming. A 2016 survey of the world's leading permafrost experts reached a chilling consensus. What was once a massive, stable carbon sink is on track to become a massive carbon source by the end of this century. The frozen ground that Canada was built on is now threatening to unbuild the stability of the global climate.
So where does that leave us? What does this all mean? It means the grand, heroic 19th and 20th century solutions for conquering Canada's geography, the railways that bound the nation together, the seaways that opened it to the world, have created some of its most complex and dangerous 21st century problems. The very act of wrestling with geography has just created a whole new set of challenges to wrestle with, on a scale those original builders could never have imagined.
The story of Canada is a powerful reminder that nation building is never simple and it's never finished. The economic corridors that created a country from sea to sea also left a complex inheritance of social inequality and profound environmental vulnerability. And that forces us to ask a much broader question, one that applies to all of us, no matter where we live. What are the hidden costs, the social and environmental price tags of the roads, the bridges, the internet cables, and the power grids that we all depend on every single day? It's a question worth thinking about long after this is over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And if you want more stories that look beneath the surface, make sure you're subscribed.